And I was telling David Allman this morning before we sat down that I think perhaps in 5 years we may look back at today's breakfast speaker as one of the more significant speakers we've had in Georgia. At least I hope so. And that's not to diminish in any way some of the fine speakers we've had here. But Benno C. Schmidt, President of the Edison Project, I think carries with him this morning a very important message, and I will leave that to him. But let me just briefly tell you what the Edison Project is. It is a privately sponsored nationwide effort to create innovative schools that provide all students, regardless of their economic or social circumstances, with an education that is rooted in democratic values, that is academically excellent, and that prepares students for productive lives. The Edison Project works in partnership with local school boards and charges for its services only what would otherwise be spent on those same students were they to attend any other school in the school system. Prior to taking over the helm at the Edison Project, Benno Schmidt was the 20th president of Yale University. During his tenure at Yale, which began in 1986, Mr. Schmidt presided over one of the largest building programs in Yale's history. He became one of Yale's most successful fundraisers. He fashioned a model partnership between the university and the city of New Haven, and he helped build a number of new interdisciplinary programs, especially in the fields of environmental sciences and policy and international studies. During his presidency, Yale's endowment grew from $1.7 billion to over $3 billion, the highest rate of growth among any of the major endowed private universities. As president, Benno Schmidt oversaw Yale College and 11 graduate and professional schools, approximately 2,000 faculty members, 7,000 staff members, some 11,000 students, and operating and capital budgets of over $900 million. Before joining Yale, Benno Schmidt was the dean of the Columbia University School of Law, where in 1973 he became one of the youngest tenured professors ever in Columbia's history. He is a legal scholar who specializes in the areas of constitutional law, the history of the United States Supreme Court, the law of freedom of expression, and the history of race relations in American law. Benno Schmidt served as law clerk to Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He is married to Helen Cutting Whitney, director of feature films and television documentaries, and he has 3 children. It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Benno Schmidt.
Thank you, Griff, and thank you to the Georgia Public Policy Foundation for this opportunity to speak with you. I sometimes find in groups like this that there's some surprise that someone would leave the presidency of Yale, which is one of the world's truly great universities, to tackle a completely novel, innovative, untried project such as the Edison Project. I sometimes think of what Woodrow Wilson said when he was asked to explain why he would leave the presidency of Princeton to become governor of New Jersey, then ultimately, of course, president of the United States. He used to say, I couldn't stand the politics. I think if I had to put it in a similarly somewhat lighthearted way, I might say I left Yale for the Edison Project because I wanted to get involved in education. Now, I don't mean that in the sense of the rather comical stereotype of the modern university president harried by problems of finances and faculty morale and, of course, football. No, being president of a great university is about as challenging a task and interesting a task as one could wish. But it is not, in my opinion, a responsibility that is on the front lines of the battle where our nation is truly at risk. We have our colleges and universities, our system of higher education, for all its problems, and none of us who have worked in those institutions would deny the sizable challenges they face. But our institutions of higher education are the envy of the world. Students from all over this globe study and hope and save and plan to try to come to our colleges and universities, and rightly so. And in the diversity of these institutions, from bustling community colleges to great sprawling state universities to the old private institutions tracing their roots back to colonial days, to small liberal arts institutions, to religious institutions, to specialized institutions dealing with everything from agriculture and engineering to the arts. These diverse, competitive, on the whole innovative institutions are serving well our nation's democratic values and our future promise and prosperity. Now compare those institutions to the conditions and performance of our nation's schools. Far from being a symbol internationally of America's excellence, our schools are increasingly viewed as a symbol of America's incipient decline, like our decaying infrastructures, terrible problems in our cities, our paralyzed politics. About 11 years ago, I became most concerned about this problem when I read a report that I guess it's fair to say has changed my life. I refer to the report by a well-informed group of moderate Americans appointed by the President to study the condition of our public schools, who summed up their conclusions in the title, A Nation at Risk. Many of you, I'm sure, have read that report, even though it is now over 10 years old. It amply documented the basis for its conclusion, and I quote a couple of its points. Quote, "A rising tide of mediocrity in our schools is threatening the very foundations of our democracy." Or another chilling quote near the end of that document, "If a hostile foreign power had imposed upon the United States the performance and condition of our public schools, Americans would be justified in regarding that as an act of war." You may recall the dismal realities that lay behind these tough, troubling conclusions. These realities have not changed since the report was issued now 11 years ago, and I'll just update the statistics. They're about the same as they were to current realities, just so we're talking about the present. I might say one of the good changes that has happened largely as a result of the efforts of successive administrations in Washington and continued by the Clinton administration is that we do know more and more and more about the real condition of our schools as a result of serious and pretty good surveys of our national educational progress. I could cite you a litany. Here's just a few. Of our high school seniors who graduate from America's schools, 6% are prepared to do elementary math at the college level. Among juniors in high school, only half can do 7th grade mathematics. I'll give you an example of what half of our high school juniors can't master. I know it's early in the morning and you may need a pencil to do this exercise. Here's a problem from the latest national assessment test. Write the number 9 and draw a line under it, and write the number 100. Now convert that fraction to a percent. Half of the juniors in the United States can't handle that. Fewer than 6%, only about 6% of the seniors in America's schools could solve a simple problem that involved, let us say, a simple two-step function. Anne borrowed $900 for 12 months at 6% interest. When she repaid the loan and the interest, what did she have to pay after 12 months? Now, about 10%, only about 1 in 10 of our high school seniors can write a coherent paragraph or read something of the average complexity of a typical newspaper story and accurately sum up its contents. This is another finding from the latest national assessment tests. I could go on and on about this. It's no wonder, is it, with performance of this kind, that American students at all levels, from grade school through high school, come in at or near the bottom of every international test of comparative academic proficiency with students in developed countries in other parts of the world. And I'll say to this group that about that particular issue, that there is a myth that our best students are doing okay. The valedictorian in the best high school in Atlanta would be in about the 50th percentile of her class in Korea or Japan, Taiwan, West Germany, about the 50th percentile. Now, I'm so far describing the fortunate beneficiaries of our educational system because the most troubling aspect of our system is not even these problems of what you might call quality. They lie instead, in my opinion, in the tragic problems of inequality in our schools. I've been describing the fortunate students who make it through our schools. Remember that 1 in 5 of young people in the United States will not graduate from high school and will face, in the conditions of our present and future, when the capacity to read and analyze and understand the basic elements of mathematics, work in cooperative ways, learn through a lifetime of change. The Department of Labor tells us that youngsters coming into the workforce today can expect at least 6 basic career changes in their professional lives. A lifetime of continued learning is the requisite for a reasonable degree of participation and hope, promise, not to say prosperity, in the America and the world of the future. 1 in 5 young people who do not graduate from high school face very small prospects of this promise and participation and prosperity. And in our large city systems, take Chicago, for example, 1 in 2 young people will not make it through high school, 50%. And the ones who persevere, the determined ones, the fortunate ones who persevere in the Chicago public schools, will graduate and find themselves in the bottom 5% of academic achievement in the United States, an average level of achievement which I've described as about the worst in the developed world. I cannot tell you too strongly that I believe these findings, this inequality in our education system, is as fundamental a threat to our democracy and our values as anything could possibly be. At least since the closing of the frontier, schools, educational institutions have been by far the single most critical open or closed door of opportunity for our young people. Our educational institutions ought to be the institutions that are helping to heal the divisions in our society, whether those are divisions of wealth and poverty or race or the accident of whether a youngster happens to be born in Chicago or up the road in Evanston or Winnetka. Now, just a few other facts that one has to take note of as one looks at our schools. We spend more on our schools than any other developed country in the world except Switzerland. We've almost tripled the spending on our schools in real terms after inflation over the last 3 decades, and we have nothing to show for it in terms of academic progress. Spending as much as we do relative to other countries and our own past, one has to wonder why the United States has the shortest school year in the world. On average, one of the shortest school days in the world. Let me just mention, I could take any number of ways of thinking about schools. Let me mention just 3. Time, technology, and accountability or responsiveness. Time is pretty simple. Does it strike you as odd that, given our problems and the incredible changes in our society, that our school calendar has not changed since America was an agricultural society? The 178-day school year is a product of a time when half our people worked on farms or ranches or in agricultural pursuits. That's fewer than 3% now, and our school calendar hasn't changed. Does it strike you as odd that the school day, well, 8:30 to 2:30 in most places or thereabouts, hasn't changed since World War I? Does it strike you as odd that there's been no change in the school day in response to such revolutionary changes in our society as American mothers going to work? Or the fact that 60% of our young people will find themselves living at some point in their youth in a single-parent home, and that most of those single parents will be working parents and hard-working parents? Wouldn't you think that in a time of the revolutionary changes in the American family, the needs of young people, with vastly greater funding going to education, with all of us understanding how much more critical education is for the future of kids, it strikes me as odd that we've seen no changes, or very few, in the school day. That's pretty mundane, although it's tremendously important. Let's take something not so mundane, technology. I think that of all the intellectual revolutions that we're living through in our lives in this latter part of this century, that maybe the most fundamental is the revolution in the information sciences. Certainly every activity I know of that involves information, its creation, its exchange, its analysis, its understanding, has been revolutionized by the revolution in information technology, by computers, by telecommunications, by the incredible potential of interactive communications capacity. Schools are mostly about that. They're about a lot of things, but they're mostly about information. The creation of knowledge, its dissemination, its analysis. 95% of America's classrooms don't have a phone line. 95%. American education is untouched by the revolution in computers. We've got a ratio of computers to our schools of about 20 to 1. I want to ask any of you who are running an accounting firm, a law firm, a bank, any business that depends on the rapid, accurate, equitable opportunity for people to have technology, whether you would give the critical professionals in your business 1 computer for every 20 so that it sits over there in the corner as a plant stand, and when it's needed people have to line up to work on it. You wouldn't do that. You know that for technology to bring its awesome power to the disposal of human beings, it has to be pervasive. It has to be available. It has to be ubiquitous. And yet schools are operating. It's said that if someone from the 19th century came back to America and wandered around the country, the only place they'd feel totally at home would be in schools. And this is, except unfortunately in many respects the schools aren't performing nearly as well as they did in the 19th century, but there it is. So in terms of technology as well as in terms of time, it's very hard not to come to the conclusion that schools are strikingly anachronistic, that their resistance to change is in many ways their most compelling and powerful characteristic. Or take accountability and responsiveness. Americans believe in that. Americans believe in accountability. That's one of the reasons we believe in competition. It's one of the reasons the antitrust laws are virtually a part of our national constitution, if you will. We know the value of innovation. We know that competition tends to produce responsiveness and efficiency, risk-taking, innovation, choices for people, opportunity. Well, how would you measure schools in terms of responsiveness and accountability? I think if you analyze schools in those terms, it would be hard not to conclude that the fundamental structure of our schools defeats accountability and responsiveness in every way. At the Edison Project, we brought in a lot of experts on accountability from business schools and from industry, and they pointed out something that I had never thought of, is to just show you how rudimentary, at least my thinking about this problem was. They pointed out that the fundamental unit of schooling makes accountability impossible. Teachers in our current system work with a group of 20, 30, sometimes more students for about 8 months at a time, and then those students leave, and 3 months later, a new group of 30 students comes in, and that teacher has 8 months or so to work with those students. And after the 5th grade, it's typically a group of 3 or 4 or 5 teachers who work with those 30 students for 8 months, and then they turn over and off they go. This is impossible. How many of you would organize your enterprises so that the key professionals in your enterprise had 30 direct reports for 8 months and then they all left and 30 completely new ones came in? It won't work. Our teachers aren't given the opportunity to get to know these young people and vice versa, and they're not given the time to work with them on their serious potential for learning and promise, as well as their difficulties. And of course, at the unit of the principal and the school and the school board, issues of responsiveness and accountability, I think it's fair to say, are at a nadir in terms of public respect and conviction. Our politics isn't serving us very well here in terms of introducing what politics is supposed to do, responsiveness and accountability. People often talk about the problem of accountability in politics as this business that incumbents never leave and so on. It ain't that way with school boards, let me tell you. 1 out of 3 members of school boards in the United States change every year. School superintendents change now on an average of every 2.5 years. This frenetic revolving door of political and administrative leadership makes long-term strategic thinking almost impossible in the actual political conditions of most schools. Now, I want to say a couple of things real loud and clear. The problems I'm describing are not with the people in this system. I know hundreds of teachers and principals and superintendents, and they're some of the best people I've ever encountered in my life. Our schools they're not absolutely full, but they're almost full of committed, devoted people who are trying to do a first-class job, but they're working in a system that systematically and structurally makes their job incredibly difficult, if not virtually impossible. Well, it was views of this kind that led me to think the presidency of Yale is not quite the front line on the educational fight for this country's survival that we need to undertake in the years ahead. If the problems are structural, if a symptom of those structural problems is schools that are 100 years out of date, if another symptom is a lack of accountability, an absence of innovation, an absence of responsiveness, an absence of all the things that competition tends to give us, then it seemed to me that there might be room among the many things that we need to work on in our schools, among the many, there might be room for a new approach that tries to harness some of the power and the characteristics of the private sector to approach some of the urgent difficulties of our schools. Anyway, that's the basic conception of the Edison Project. What might come about if a private effort were made to bring together a varied, creative group of people, educators, but not only educators, also experts in technology, experts in systems and organization, experts in management, alongside experts in motivation and child development and so on. And what if this group were given the money to step aside and think and plan and consult with hundreds of people around the country and the world and question every aspect of schools as they are traditionally designed and run? And what if this group, in addition to doing research and planning, bringing into being a new kind of school and concept of school, were given the opportunity in partnership with public school systems to bring these schools into being and to run them, and manage them with accountability built in at every level, manage them with a commitment to excellence and performance built in, with responsiveness to the needs of the customers in the broadest sense, the children, the families, the taxpayers who support this, who support our public schools. What might happen if parents had a real choice among different models of schools? And we introduced competition into the system so that successful schools would flourish and multiply and unsuccessful ones would fail and wither. I can't tell you how many superintendents I've talked to about working with the Edison Project. If a gleam has come into their eye and they've said, golly, you may fail in your Edison schools, but wow, what a pleasure it would be to fire a failing school. Very few superintendents can do that. What if we could introduce this innovative and competitive and accountable new model into public school systems? What might happen? I think a revolution might happen. A revolution at a structural level, I mean, not because we at the Edison Project have the answer. There is no the answer here, but because real competition and conditions where new schools can come into being and parents and school boards and others can have real choices among these schools. And as I said, sort out the successful ones from the from the failing ones. It struck me as the kind of opportunity to change one part of our sector that one might think of when one thinks of the impact of Federal Express on the way we've distributed tangible information, or the impact of the breakup of Ma Bell on the way telephonic communications. Anyway, that's the conception. We've worked for 2 years to question every aspect of school and to come up with a new design. It's not particularly original, I would be the first to say. We've taken the best practices of schools in this country around the world and integrated them together in a comprehensive design. 2 or 3 highlights, and then I'll stop because I'm eager to hear your questions. We've decided it's time that schools were serious about time. Our short school day and our short year will not do the job. Schools need to play a larger role in the lives of young people and their families. Schools need to be open 11 or 12 hours a day, so working parents have an opportunity to play a part in schools. Schools need to be open, we think, 20–25% longer in terms of the calendar year. Our schools would be open, would have an academic year of about 210 days instead of the 178 days that's now current. By the way, and our school day, the academic core of our day, about an hour and a half longer, though we think schools ought to have before school and after school activities for kids who need them and flourish them. Latchkey children are, in my opinion, more the product of our schools than any other institution, certainly. Don't think that time doesn't make much difference. The added time I've just described in a typical kindergarten through 12th grade career of a young person adds 5 academic years as we now measure them. Now, that time is no good unless you use it well. More time in the current system might be counterproductive. I don't know. I remember what Robert Hutchins, the great president of the University of Chicago, used to say. He said, educators are the only people who think you can turn vices into virtues by making them bigger. And so with time, making school longer isn't going to do it unless you change, unless you change the dynamics. But if you do, 5 years counts. One reason that we're where we are in comparison with youngsters in Japan and so forth is they have 6 more years of education under their belt by the time they graduate from high school. Time counts. Technology counts. Our plan involves something that the private sector can do that I know public bodies have a terrible problem doing, and that is making careful planned trade-offs between upfront capital investment and continuing investment in labor and, supplies and other inputs. If you can't do that, you can't deal with technology. We think we can. We have a plan that puts a computer in the home of every child in our school, starting in the 1st grade. That puts computers and state-of-the-art telecommunications and imaging equipment in every classroom. It's a technology plan in which technology is pervasive, always available. It's ubiquitous. Every teacher has a laptop. The school is completely networked with an instructional management system. The first one, by the way, can you believe for all the IMS systems, there's no IMS system in the world that stands for Instructional Management System in our schools, and we're working to develop the first one. There are going to be many. Each school networked in itself, each partnership school networked to the whole system of partnership schools around the country. So teachers and kids in our school in Boston, where we'll be opening a charter school in a year and a half, can be in touch with kids in Wichita, Kansas, where we've just contracted to bring this program into 3 public schools in '95. Technology. We think technology has revolutionary potential. It's time someone tried that. And accountability. We'd like to see what happens when principals and teachers and everyone in the school are accountable for the success of that school are rewarded on the basis of that school's success, or in terms of the children's progress, or not rewarded in the absence of that. Where Lamar Alexander used to say, teaching is the only profession in the United States where it doesn't make a dollar's worth of difference, and this is literally true in most systems, where it doesn't make a dollar's worth of difference whether you do a great job or a lousy job. Well, we'd like to change that. We'd like to compensate teachers better than they're compensated, and approach their profession with real investment in professional development. And we think we can do all this and operate, as was said, at the same per pupil spending as public schools now invest. It's almost $6,000 a student per year now in operating expenses, and probably a third higher than that if you include capital expenses. We're spending a lot, though very, very inequitably and unequally, but we're spending a lot in aggregate on public education, and we think it's enough to afford the kind of ambitious program we've described. We hope to open our first 15 or 20 public partnership Edison schools on this model I've described in the fall of '95 as elementary schools first that would grow, and we would add schools each year to the system until we hope to create the first technologically integrated national school system in the history of the country. It's an exciting thing to work on, a lot of fun, and I think it has promise. The best promise that it offers, though, is at the structural level, not our answers, not our design, not our schools, but the idea of introducing a structure of competition and accountability and real choice among different options. That's the Edison Project. I'm eager for your questions. Thank you. Sir.
I agree with what you said about time. I've got a kindergarten-age child and also a second grader. I did notice the second grader went through private school in kindergarten, and they accomplished in 3 hours what the public schools were accomplishing in 7.5 hours during the day. So I do agree that time is not the answer unless it's well structured. And I guess my question along that line is, if you put kids in school all year round, 11 to 12 hours a day, is that more of a burden on the teachers to try to keep that classroom structured? How would you structure that so that the teachers have time to do the things that teachers have to do in terms of evaluating students day to day? Is there free time for the children to work on their own while the teachers grade papers, for example?
Yeah, well, one of the great things one learns from Japanese schools is they have a recess after every class. Kids weren't meant to sit there hour after hour, and so more time means more flexibility. You're absolutely right. It means the opportunity for teachers to work in teams with groups of students for years rather than months. It means our internal organization of schools gives our teachers 2.5 hours a day every day free to plan their lessons. Most American teachers don't have any time to plan. So you're right. More time is also, most importantly, flexibility and breaking up routines. But time really is critical, and there are a lot of schools in America, and there are a lot of good schools in the United States, by the way, from which we've learned a tremendous amount. And some of the best schools, particularly flourishing in inner city communities, have shown that the difference, a longer school day, a longer school year, can have just dramatic consequences. I don't want to get into this, but if you know the education research on how much kids forget in the average summer vacation, so that how much time is spent catching up again. And if you look at the research on the inequality there between how much disadvantaged kids forget during the summer as compared to more advantaged kids, researchers have concluded that the summer vacation is the biggest single contributor to inequality of outcome in city schools, the biggest single one. So So time is real important, sir.
Could you just talk a little bit about your strategy and how you're trying to sell this concept into the public school system?
We're saying to public school systems, we offer a program and a school design that is completely consistent with your public purposes. This is a great design for all kids. It's a design that's highly individual in the way it approaches kids. These are going to be good schools for gifted kids, for kids who are at risk, kids who have trouble. These are schools that are non-discriminatory, non-sectarian, public schools open to all. We offer you real accountability. We won't work with a public school system unless the students in our schools are there as a matter of their own free will. We don't want involuntary students and families. Unless we're delivering for parents and students, we will be out of there, and we promise to public school systems academic achievement benchmarks. So we're saying to public school systems, look, you turn to the private sector for much of what you do and need, whether it's to buy computers or increasingly school boards are contracting out transportation services or school maintenance services to ServiceMaster or Marriott or Ogden or whatever. And school boards know, I think they know, that, gee, they're a whole lot better off when they can turn to a private competitive marketplace for something like computers or pencils and paper than when they have to get goods and services from a government monopoly bureaucracy. And so we're saying this is an opportunity for you to further your public purpose of excellent, accessible, affordable, and accountable education, and to get the benefit of our research and development and some of the things that a private sector entity can do by way of accountability and so on that's real hard to do in a traditional public sector setting. Now, this is threatening to some people. I mean, there's just no doubt about that. Public education in the United States is a $300 billion a year activity. It's the size of the U.S. auto industry. And people have got some entrenched interests in the way this thing operates, but you know, there are thousands and thousands of public schools. We want to do this in 15 or 20 around the country, and then a few more. This is a program of small-scale focused innovation that we hope will have large-scale ripple effects through the system. Sir, yeah.
My question related to the same point. If you're saying this would be a dagger to the heart of that entrenched stand that education is adapted, how do you fight through the politics of
The question is how we fight through the politics. This would seem to be a threat to a lot of the entrenched interests in education. That's true, but there are some very important qualifications of that. The politics of education is very local. If this were a trench warfare in Washington, or even in state capitals, it would be one thing. It's not. It's in every community. And schools, as I've said, and this includes very much the bureaucracies too, are full of people who care and who know firsthand what the problems are at a systemic, structural level. Parents are militant about this situation, as are increasingly taxpayers. And in this very, very local, fragmented kind of political setting with enormous concern, and with our innovation representing small-scale innovation, we've been asked if we would take on whole systems and try to do this. Not a chance. Not a chance. To the extent we will have systemic impact, it will be slowly by example and by the introduction of innovation and competition. So the politics is one thing in Wichita, Kansas, and quite another in New York City, where I live. So I think the politics of this is small steps at a time, can add up to big changes over time. Yes, sir.
It's my understanding that from the beginning you were looking for investors to have a for-profit group and you were going to go on your own. At some point in time, there was a business decision to be a management organization and not be a for-profit, build your own system from the ground up. Could you tell us the key variables that changed that strategy?
Sure. When this project was conceived, it was thought that there was no way, for the reasons we were just discussing, that this kind of innovation could be introduced into public school systems, because the politics would put up insuperable hurdles. What happened, though, about a year and a half ago, it started with half a dozen governors who approached me and said, "You're wrong," and just to finish, so the idea was we would build private schools that would be tuition supported, but would operate at the same level of expense as public schools, so that what we would do in those private schools could be replicated. And those private schools would have no admissions requirements and large financial aid components. They'd be as much like public schools as possible, except that they'd be operated on this innovative model. And they would serve over time as catalysts for change in the public school systems. Well, what happened is Governor Weld in Massachusetts and Romer in Colorado and Tommy Thompson in Wisconsin and 3 or 4 other governors came to me and said, "You've got this wrong. Public school systems are going to be willing to take this innovation in. If you come up with a school design that's great for all kids, that operates at no more cost, that gives parents what they really want, that produces results, we'll work with you on ways to bring that into public school systems." I was very skeptical. Then Governor Weld passed his charter school law in Massachusetts, and we just got 3 of Massachusetts' first charter schools on this model. And school superintendents from Indianapolis to Miami to Wichita started saying the same things. If you have a good model, we'll contract with you. We want to bring this right into the system. Don't build private schools. That's not the answer. So we became persuaded that this is the way to reach more kids on a more equitable basis, and to put our investment dollars into program rather than into bricks and mortar, where it's relatively where it has relatively less impact. So we did change from a private school venture to a public school partnership management venture.
What do you go about if someone in Atlanta was interested? Do you put the school, take over an entire school building, or you take over part of the school?
Typically, we would take over an entire school building, or maybe the system is building a new school, or rehabilitating an old one that's failed and is emptied out. We would work in existing buildings, and we would just create a public school based on this model. Could be a neighborhood school where kids were given the chance to go based on their neighborhood residents, but where they could opt out. It needs to be a choice school, at least in that modest sense of kids can opt out, parents can opt out. We have a values curriculum. We know from talking to parents that about 95% of the parents in all groups think our values curriculum is great. But there's a small percent who think it's not right to teach values. We disagree. We don't want to argue about that. This is not necessarily a school for everybody, but it would operate in a typical public school building, old or new, and it would be a public school, but free to operate in the way that our program requires.
One more question.
One more. Yes, ma'am.
Is the groundwork being laid here in the Atlanta area or in Georgia for a school like this? And is there any likelihood that one of your schools might open in September of '95 here in this area?
We're talking to several school boards here. I'm meeting this afternoon with a school board in Atlanta. I have no idea what they're interested in meeting, so there's that level of interest. And Scott Morrow, who's our Edison representative, lives here in Atlanta and is in touch with a lot of the school systems here in the state. I think it'd be great. This is a state that cares about education. This is a state that's very unhappy with where it stands educationally. I was told Georgia is at 47th or 48th? Well, that's not where you want to be. Let me tell you, that's not where you want to be for the future of this state. This is a state that cares about education, wants to innovate, and so I hope very much that we can work with school board either here in Atlanta or other systems in the state and bring 1 or 2 Edison schools here into Georgia.